It was the year 1994 when I first got my hands on the DOS game Magic Carpet. I was 7 years old and it was one of the first full games I had, and I got it definitely because of how good the graphics looked on the screenshots on the box. A 3D world of mountains, water and sky, and at the time that was a very special thing. But the game was very confusing. At first when you load it, you're greeted with a completely impenetrable main menu with very little text, a photo frame, a spinning globe, a stack of books and an exit to the DOS prompt. And as a kid I had almost no idea what any of it did. I just remember clicking around at random until I was in the game. And when I finally, or more likely accidentally got into the game, I was greeted with a 3D world and started to fly around, and that's all I did for a while. No idea what I was meant to be doing. I picked up the 3 spells on the first level and started to shoot monsters and the townsfolk and just messed around. And for a while that was enough, because the world looks great, especially for a 1994 game, and I was mesmerised by the terrain, the wavy water, the people walking around, the giant worms. Fortunately it came with a manual, and after learning how to play, 1994's Magic Carpet quickly became one of my favourites, and is still to this day my favourite DOS game. It also came from that wonderful time in gaming where the story of the game was written in the manual, and I'm going to read just a small part for you. Within the covers of this leather-bound volume, its ancient pages coated by dust and time, is contained the history of the Wizard War. It was the great historian Molyneux the chronicler who collected these many fragments of myth and legend, preserving them for posterity in one weighty tome. His was the labour of a lifetime, writing in the ink of squids on pages of dried papyrus. Molyneux worked day and night to complete the task, but the old gods were jealous of the immortality that the completed work would grant him, and took Molyneux before the story could be finished. So the executive producer of this game is named Peter Molyneux. Molyneux, you might know him as the designer of games such as Dungeon Keeper, which actually used the same graphics engine as Magic Carpet, and is credited as the inspiration for Minecraft. I think he's most well known for the Fable series of games, role-playing games, which still continues today, and also the guy who released that app which was a cube people clicked on to try to get to the center where there would be an amazing prize, which turned out to be a 1% share of the profits of his next game, Godus, a crowd-funded game which was never finished. And here, in the lore of Magic Carpet, Peter Molyneux made himself a historian who was so powerful the gods had to kill him. As for the rest of the lore of Magic Carpet, the game is set in the aftermath of a wizard war. All living things are filled with an energy called mana, and wizards figured out that they could use mana for great benefit. But in this fantasy world of hyper-capitalism, they could never get enough, and their drive to control more and more and more of the mana caused environmental destruction, massive wars, a bunch of wizards flying around on carpets, battling over resources, mining cryptocurrencies, generating millions of images of teenage anime girls, using up all of the energy of the planet until nothing's left. And all that continued until one day, another wizard who, seeking to end all of this conflict, cast one great big spell, which just made things worse, shattering the world, killing himself in the process, and so now it was up to his young apprentice, you the player, to solve everything and bring the world back into equilibrium. So deep themes of environmentalism and how the older generation make things worse and leave it up to the next generation to fix. Except that equilibrium doesn't mean anything really, because all you do is go out there, use destructive spells, hoard the mana before the enemy wizards can, carve up the terrain until it's unrecognizable. Basically, you go out and you destroy everything and hoard the resources. You become part of the problem, and no amount of recycling, paper straws and electric cars are going to make up for it. It's a completely accurate metaphor for the 2020s. But way back in 2011, this game was re-released on GOG.com, Good Old Games, which is the version I'm showing right now, as all I have left of my original copy is this instruction booklet. Back in my parents' house is the hardcover box of the game, on which I'd scribbled my name on in Sharpie, and is filled with Kinder Surprise toys. I was 7 years old at the time when the game first came out, October 1994, which was a little over 30 years ago now, so happy anniversary Magic Carpet, and wow, where did the time go? And what happened to me? At its core, Magic Carpet is a first-person shooter, but one where you float above the ground rather than walk on it. You shoot enemies like these worms, or these birds, or these bees with destruction spells like Fireball or Lightning or Meteor, and when they die, yellow spheres come out of them. That's mana or magical power. That's the stuff all the wizards fought over. Yellow mana means it's unowned. If you use the possession spell on those spheres, it turns them white, which means you own the mana now. White is definitely my colour. All the mana you currently own can be used to cast your spells, so the more mana you have, the more spells you can cast before recharging. Then you use another spell castle to build a castle to store the mana, which rises out of the ground where you cast your spell, and a hot air balloon is created along with it. This balloon flies to the white mana you have loose around the world and picks it up, carrying it to store in your castle to be protected from being stolen. And as you fill up your castle, the castle needs to be upgraded to store more mana. So you cast the spell again, and if you have enough mana to cast it, it gets bigger and stores more mana. So more balloons go out and pick up more mana. And that continues until you hoard enough mana in your castle to hit the goal amount for the level, which is shown by 2 pixels on the user interface, and you get the message, "Well restored, press space to continue." And that's the goal of every single level in Magic Carpet, and that's why I needed the manual. I wasn't alone in being confused. I looked up videos of gameplay of Magic Carpet, and I see a lot of comments along the lines of, "I remember playing this as a kid and have absolutely no idea what I was doing, and I had no idea how to play this game as a kid. I just flew around everywhere randomly," which is a relief to me because it means I wasn't just particularly stupid. And soon, rival wizards start to appear, who don't just fight you, they build their own castles, they collect mana as well, which turns it into their colours. They try to steal your mana, they attack you and your castle. They have spells exactly like yours and honestly use them way better than you ever can. And during the first 20 or so of these levels, you get more and more spells, and there's a lot of spells. Some just cause damage like Fireball or Lightning. Some destroy the terrain like Earthquake or Crater. Some more interesting spells include the Skeleton Army, which creates a few skeleton archers who are loyal to no one, who would shoot at whatever is nearby, including you, but are great for taking down enemy wizards and their castles. There's Speed Up to travel distances faster. There's a spell to see where the opposing players are. There's a spell to turn invisible, and there's a spell to reflect projectiles. There's a lot of spells. And there's a good variety of enemies too. The worms that crawl, the worms that fly, the birds that peck you, the bees that sting you, the archers that defend villages, the emu riders which shoot you, the skeleton archers that shoot everyone, the griffins which reflect spells, the kraken which pull you in, the wyvern which are just fire-breathing dragons. There are crabs which eat mana and grow bigger and multiply, the genies that steal your magic power and laugh at you, the apes and trolls that throw boulders at you and regenerate health. It's quite the menagerie. And now I'm going to say something that will make it sound like I hate the game, but I really love the game. The enemy roster and spell list is obviously just a bunch of spells and creatures slapped together haphazardly with no thought to how they would play together gameplay-wise. The most effective technique in-game is to just use lightning spells, because they can't be reflected by the enemies that can reflect spells like griffins and other players. So you'll want to stick to those and use them as much as you can. There's no special techniques to dealing with any of the monsters really besides that. Even the enemy wizards are the same, because they have some of your spells, and sometimes one of their spells is Reflect. And there's no sign, no indication, no cast time. They just instantly hit their Reflect spell when you fire a weapon at them. And if you cast a non-lightning projectile at an enemy wizard after about level 5, maybe even earlier, it's more likely than not just going to get reflected back at you, so don't even try it and just use lightning. And once you get the skeleton army, that's the best thing to take out the enemy castles. You can fire them off, circle around their castle as it's being attacked by skeletons, and then collect the mana that pops out of it. And switching between spells, using the number keys while you're using the arrows to move around and the mouse to control your turning, there's no hand free. And since it really requires you to have the spells ready to use when things happen, such as in parts of the game it just spawns a whole lot of bees on you suddenly and you need a speed boost or a shield to get out of it, you have to take your hand off the movement controls to switch to the spell, but only if you have it hotkeyed already, and those hotkeys reset every level. And I love this game so much. even though it is a stupid mess with repetitive gameplay and essentially nothing in the way of strategy, terrible inconsistent performance, unreliable, buggy, and prone to crashes, and made up of a bunch of parts which don't fit together, it's still my favourite DOS game. It's something about the atmosphere, the feel of it, the vibe.
Just the vibe of the thing.
And maybe a whole heap of nostalgia clouding my judgment. But flying through the software-rendered sky, with the Arabian-inspired soundtrack, fighting these creatures, collecting the mana, watching the hot air balloons pick it all up, growing the castle. It's super basic, especially now, but playing it and not thinking too hard about it, it suddenly feels so right. All of those parts should not work together, and indeed mostly do not. But it's been installed and randomly played on my computer for so long it must be doing something right. But I would certainly not go as far as to say, as in this PC Gamer article from 2009, that it's a game of violent chess. Insert overblown stereotypes about video game journalists here. So those performance issues I mentioned, it's not that it's too slow, it's 30 years old now. The problem is that it runs as fast as it can, but each moment of the game is very different in computational intensity. So if your computer is just fast enough to run the game at the right speed when there's nothing happening, as soon as enemies appear or explosions happen, it slows down to a crawl. But if your PC is fast enough to run at all the times, that means it's too fast to run most of the time. And it's impossible to control. You can see it if you fly around. You look at the ground and the game runs slow as it tries to draw all of those polygons at high resolution 640 by 480. But then you look up at the sky and the basic sky effects run really fast, and suddenly the game is running too fast. There's only about 25 good levels. The rest are annoying, but 25 probably plenty. There's 45 levels in total. The manual says 50, but 5 are just missing. But a lot of the later levels have a weird trick or quirk to them that ruins the fun. So I suggest you play up until you see that some of your spells have gone missing, because it's not as good from that point. It's like playing Need for Speed Underground, right? The first couple hours are great, but then it gets really tedious. There are some awful levels. One particular standout being a level where you have lost most of your spells, and with the laughing genie following you around that you can't do anything about. So it's just constantly laughing at you. And you don't have the mana to properly cast any spells, and you can't make a castle, which is a shame because the best way to take genies out is to put a castle under them, which destroys them. And you're surrounded by flocks of enemies, so if you get too close, you die straight away. So you just have to watch the map for any blobs of black dots, which are probably birds or bees, who, if they catch you, you have no way of dealing with them and they move faster than you. So you die and have to totally restart, hunting for scraps of mana, while the genie plays the laugh sound over and over again. There's a lot of moments like that later on. It becomes not worth playing. I finished that level after many tries and I hated every minute of it. I hated every minute of playing this game I really love. There are a lot of times where enemies are created just when you enter a spot, like an invisible trigger. You fly to a location, it plays a musical sting, and suddenly there's 20 bees or a bunch of wyverns around you that weren't there before. It's not great, and there's nothing you can do about it when it happens except die. And if you have no castle to respawn at, like in some of the later levels when you can't make one, you have to restart the entire level. From an event where there's literally no warning, which is a common occurrence in later levels, suddenly enemies spawn which destroy you in less than a second. Before you can move your hand from the arrows to the hotkeys for shield or move fast. The levels where you're locked in a small area with walls you can't go past are some of the worst, the most notorious to me being level 33. It makes you into a maze and slowly gather spells and mana. You're trapped with all these enemies with only your crappiest spells, barely any mana, including a wyvern you can't actually defeat yet, and then if it randomly looks in your direction, you lose. So you have to try and avoid that while slowly making your way through the rest of the enemies with crappy spells. It's a slog. And worse still, I played through that level really slowly. I found all the teleports and I survived, and I found the invisible trigger points which open up walls. I went around the maze until it looped back around and I could not find an exit. I killed every enemy that I could see and get to. I went all the way around, no exit. There is a section of the map I can just see with a spell in it, the red dot, which I assume is something to bring down the walls, but I can't get to it, and I can't find any way of triggering it. The only way I found to get out was to spam cast the castle spell against the wall until it glitched, and summon the castle on the wall, which was not supposed to happen, but you can do it if you hit it just right, and it destroys the wall and makes a way out. I've never found any other way of getting out of this level. The very next level, 34, has a different problem. Because there's a limit to the amount of stuff that can be in the game world at once, a big limit, but when it's reached, it just can't create any new things. And that includes fireballs, your weapon effects, possession spell, castle, lightning bolts, everything. And level 34 hits this cap straight away, almost straight away, within a couple minutes at most, because it's one big village with hundreds of people. You see those houses and the people wandering around? Here's another addition to the game that absolutely does not fit in with anything else in the game and in fact causes issues having it. The townsfolk mechanics. Those townsfolk are made up of townies, traders and builders. Townies spawn around buildings and live around them. Traders wander around between buildings, but the most interesting ones are the builders, which create new buildings. And buildings create new townies. And so the cities spread out and get bigger and bigger with more buildings, more civilians. And eventually, when they're big enough, they create archers, which would be so cool if it didn't break the game if you left them too long. Because that limit on the things of the world, all of those townsfolk, the townies, the traders, builders and archers, all of them contribute to that limit of things that are allowed to be in the world. And in level 34, it hits the limit almost straight away after maybe a minute when I did it last, because it's just one big village creating townsfolk and archers repeatedly. And then you and the enemies can't do anything because you can't even shoot a fireball. The war is over. You can't fight anymore. So you just end up flying around unable to shoot a single thing. The only way I got through this level, I found, without cheating, is to go in guns blazing. You shoot and destroy every civilian and building you can. You go out there, you commit war crimes in the name of stopping the wizard war. What's that building? A children's hospital for orphans? The controls are quite dated too, but I can't really fault it for that, because it's 30 years old. Flying around still feels pretty good considering its age. You really zoom around the world with the mouse and the arrow keys. Arrows to change the forward and backward speed, and slide left and right with the left and right. The mouse to turn, which tilts the whole screen in a way which feels genuinely and smooth and impressive for 1994. The carpet feels very controllable and responsive. There's no crashing, you can't plow into mountains or water, it just stays on top of everything. The flight controls keep things very simple in a way which really benefits the game. Selecting spells is rubbish though. You can press enter to open the spell list and click on the spell you want, which takes time and means you can't control your carpet while you're doing it, but you have access to every spell. You can also, for some reason, press both left and right mouse buttons together to open the screen. But if you have the shield in your right mouse button slot, it actually just levels down your castle, which kicks all the mana out into the world that it can't fit anymore. I'm not sure why that's a thing, and it's not in the manual, and I only did it by accident. In the spell menu, you can also hotkey spells to the numbers on the keyboard, so you don't have to open the map every time to select with the mouse, but they get cleared between levels. They aren't saved for you, so you have to reset them again. And since you're flying using the arrow keys, your hand has to travel pretty far to select the numbers 1 to 5, and every time you start the next level, they are auto-numbered 1 to 10, 0, which means they're different depending on which spells you've unlocked. And when they start taking spells away, you just don't know what number goes to what when you first load in. So you have to manually fix them every time. You also can't hotkey spells for the left and right mouse button slots separately, so you can hotkey them for the first mouse button slot and not the second. So you end up having the same spell in the right mouse button slot the whole time. Probably possess. But more importantly, for us elderly people who were around when this came out, my hand hurts from playing it now. A problem I didn't used to have. The fireball spell, possession, most of the early spells, the ones you always have to start with until you get enough mana for the larger ones. One click, one cast. So if I want to take out a big group of birds or bees, I got to click a lot and rapidly. I click the hell out of that fireball to take out as many as fast as I can. And maybe as a child, I could handle clicking that rapidly, but now my hand just hurts. but if you click too slow, it takes way too long to take even the most basic enemies out. The version on GOG is the Plus version of Magic Carpet, which is great because the original was so buggy it was mostly unplayable. Much has been said about modern games and their tendency to be filled with game-breaking bugs, but truthfully it's kind of always been like that, especially for PC games. And worse, to get the patch for Magic Carpet so you can actually play it, kind of just had to buy the new version of it. But good news, Magic Carpet Plus came with an expansion pack called Hidden Worlds, so not a total rip-off, it's 25 more levels. And it has snow textures sometimes. It's fine, but it does start off with some of the annoying traits of the later levels of the base game, things from the second half of Magic Carpet that just didn't age well or were never good. So I hadn't really played much of it before. Also, if you save your game and you already have saves from the original, it can glitch pretty badly. Suddenly enemies are not animating anymore, like a wyvern flying without flapping its wings, and then it'll randomly crash even more. Even a clean reinstall of the game with no save data didn't solve a lot of these issues for me, so I think it's just buggy in general. But the graphics are impressive and worth celebrating and maybe giving a bit of a shout out. Some of, but not all, the game's graphics were programmed by a guy called Corpes. For some reason, he's not on the list of programs on the Magic Carpet Wikipedia page, but if you go to his page you can see that he created the 3D landscape which was used in Magic Carpet. It is interesting to think about all the environmental themes inside the game Magic Carpet because considering a later game programmed by Glenn for the PlayStation 2 called Battle Engine Aquila has this plot summary. The ice caps on the planet Allium have melted due to the greenhouse effect. As a result, most of the planet's surface ended up underwater. Only 13 islands scattered across the surface remain and only 2 civilizations of Allium's human-like inhabitants are left. The peaceful and technological Forseti and the aggressive Muspel. Both civilizations are on the brink of war with each other in a battle over the remaining land masses. Doesn't that sound like a variation on the theme? First-person battles while flying above terrain. It looks like something I would have loved to have played if I'd known about it before the research for this video. The research for this video, which was supposed to be a quick, short thing I made because I wanted to talk about a game I liked. This video, don't look at the time. Corpes has a blog entry about this game, made from when it was re-released on GOG, which is a pretty interesting entry because it talks about one of the major limitations of the game, the view distance. You could probably tell the view distance isn't good enough, and he knew it. But when he originally programmed it, as he tells in the blog post and some interviews, the grid of the world was scaled up much larger, so the same amount of polygons covered a much larger area. But when someone, a guy he calls out Barry Mead of FireproofStudios.com, came up with the idea to use the terrain tiles to build the castles as well, which is cool, he had to scale it down and it didn't work quite so well. The author, Glenn, happily laid blame on him on this comment on his post which says unknown user, but it is the author because if you click on the name unknown it shows that that account runs this blog. I did do my due diligence, okay? Not a slop channel. And it's backed up by a real article from Games TM, which only the archived version remains, but it's a really good look into the creation of the game, down to some small details about who was doing what, to really emphasize how much using the terrain for building changed things. A quote from Glenn: "Making buildings out of the landscape was a ridiculous idea that forced the scale to change and effectively brought the draw distance in from 400 meters to just the 40 or so in the final game. It was with that hilariously small view distance that Bullfrog, the company that made this game, decided to take that game engine and make a racing game. A game made because, as told by Peter Molyneux himself, or the Chronicler Molyneux Bar as he's otherwise known, in an interview with a channel called Yogscast back in 2012, their company needed to have another of their games, Dungeon Keeper, ready in 6 weeks because they needed something to release. But he didn't want to sacrifice the quality of that game by rushing it, so he and his team knocked together Hi-Octane using the Magic Carpet engine in 6 weeks. And it definitely feels like a quickly knocked together 6-week game. It has the same issues of Magic Carpet itself, but now it's worse because of the genre of the game. While in Magic Carpet the view distance was a limitation, it's a deal breaker in a racing game. And just like how sometimes in Magic Carpet you're just looking at the map to work out where things are, In Hi-Octane, you constantly have to look at that incredibly almost useless map to know when a turn is coming up, and some of the obstacles in the track show up too late for you to do anything about them. For example, a ramp which you need to hit at the right time so you can get onto the roof of the tunnel if you want to go faster, because otherwise you go into the water in the tunnel and slow down. You can't see the ramp raise and lower, so you can't exactly time your approach. It also has the speed tied to the speed of the machine as well, just like Magic Carpet. But now that means, even if you could see the obstacles approach, it's so hard to judge the speed of your vehicle to handle it. So it's a good thing the handling is also loose and garbage as well. And as confessed in many interviews, all the vehicles handle exactly the same, no matter what the menu says when you select them. I consider the combat and weapons also terrible in this game. I've read people said they liked it, but I think they're awful. I think they're ineffective and pointless to use. There's a ship fuel armor ammo meter which needs refilling, but the recharge stations, they expect you to stop your car to properly recharge, but I never seem to need to. The heads-up display is confusing and messy, and the races go on for far too long with far too many laps. But the most hilarious thing is that when you finish the race, you have to wait until every other racer finishes before you can continue. So if you come first, and you probably will, you have to wait for every single racer to finish. And it can take 5 or so minutes where you can't do anything but wait. I played it as a kid and I loved it, but unlike with Magic Carpet, that love has significantly waned, and now I just see a bad game. I did only play the demo as a kid though, but since the full game's expanded list of vehicles all behave the exact same as the demo vehicles, the only thing in the full game not in the demo are the other tracks, and none of them are worth it. But I have to hand it to them. The game engine was improved in some ways, surprising ways considering the 6 weeks they had. There are a lot more details, like caves and terrain you can pass under, completely vertical walls, 3D vehicles. For 6 weeks that's pretty great, but it's possible that they just had it already but just switched off in Magic Carpet most likely, especially considering it's the same game engine also being used in Dungeon Keeper, which is, now I think about it, full of vertical walls. Let's talk ports. You can't talk about classic games without talking about ports, and you can't be a gaming YouTuber without putting on video game merch and sitting on a couch like an early 2000s webcomic character. Hi-Octane is a case where I think the PS1 version is a little bit better than the PC version. Not much better, but better. It doesn't have high res mode, of course, it's a PlayStation game, and it has an uglier sky, so visually it's worse, but it has a much more consistent game speed, which makes controlling the vehicles less bad. However, it came out in the same year as the original Wipeout, 1995, about 3 months later, so it didn't even get to come out first to avoid the obvious comparison. And since both games are in the same genre, they're futuristic hovercar racing with weapons, it would have been hard to recommend this game at all, even just when it came out. But it did get positive reviews at the time, and I can see why some reviewers might have positively reviewed it. Compared to when you first load up Wipeout, which is a very difficult game and you feel like a total failure for hours of hitting walls and losing, Hi-Octane has a more immediate feeling of success, but that's just because it's unsatisfyingly simple. But in time, the tracks and vehicles in Wipeout are far more interesting and replayable, and the soundtrack in Wipeout is the stuff of legends. Now, I'm playing the Hi-Octane soundtrack in the background. While the Wipeout soundtrack is like being in a rowdy club and you're a teenager spending your first pay on vodka cruises, the Hi-Octane soundtrack is like being in a club as an adult and you want to go home. I don't have the Sega Saturn version of Hi-Octane. It actually looks worse than the PlayStation 1 based on the videos I've seen, but I can't really say for sure because I haven't played it. There are videos by people who surprisingly and genuinely really like the game, as much as I like Magic Carpet. So to each their own, and I'm happy they enjoy it, but even the chronicler Molyneux was surprised to hear people liked Hi-Octane.
He says, "Hi Peter, I loved Hi-Octane back in the day."
What? Magic Carpet also got a Saturn and a PlayStation port. This is the PlayStation version, of course, and it has a frame rate limit now as well, just like Hi-Octane, but I'd hesitate to call its speed consistent. It's all over the place with the frame rate, while at the same time having significantly worse graphics overall. It even has lower resolution textures, and what is even happening to those flag icons? There's no high resolution, of course, and as it is a PlayStation game, it has that awful, ugly sky. I want to especially call attention to the way the terrain, and in particular, the buildings are put together. The polygons aren't clean like they are on the PC. They're connected entirely wrong, and end up looking really ugly as a result. You can see in the PC version, each square of the map is made out of 2 triangles, and it picks where the square is cut in half to make the 2 triangles based on what's drawing there, so it can better represent the tops of castles, for example. But the PS1 version seems to do it entirely wrong, as if it's doing the opposite of how it should be done. And then being a PS1 game, it's got the classic tessellation and jumpy polygons, but that only emphasizes the ugliness. Basically, the beautiful art style and atmosphere of the original PC game is ruined. I had big plans of playing it and getting footage of some of the later levels because I really wanted to know how it performed with the more intense fights and spells in later levels, but I cannot handle those controls. There's no analog stick support because it's ancient, so it's all digital controls, including looking up and down and turning. It's way too hard to control, and even if the controls were good, this is me flying straight ahead, not touching anything. It feels very much like I'm just looking up at the sky. I barely see any ground unless I purposely push to look down, and the way the sky is drawn as a dome above the player, not flat, but a dome, it's very disorienting. It's hard to control, it's got bad performance, but at least it has a frame rate cap. But good news, there's a magic carpet on the PC which improves on the controls of the first, has a frame rate cap. It's the sequel, Magic Carpet 2, The Netherworlds. In it, you resume the role of the same apprentice wizard from the first game, with the same ghost master wizard guiding you, but this time leading you towards a battle with a big bad red monster named Vizoloth.
I am free, and I smell the fear of mortal men.
I didn't play this one as a child. All I knew of the sequel was mainly about how buggy it is and rushed, which, I mean, it's rushed like everything else is rushed, including the first Magic Carpet, I'd say. But I disagree with the assessment that the sequel is buggier than the first. The first game came out in a really bad state and became more playable with the expansion pack, and was filled with dodgy levels that aren't winnable without using a cheat or a glitch, speed that's all over the place, and quite randomly unstable. The second game I found pretty much just one major bug. The high-res mode is so unstable and crashes the game after 15 or so minutes. That's literally it. Other than that, the maps are more interesting, more varied locations and textures, underground levels, night levels, individual mission objectives on each level which break up the gameplay without forcing you into an unsolvable maze with your spells taken away like the first game often did. The core gameplay might be the same, but a lot of the really tedious and troublesome features were cleaned up. There are still annoying moments. In much the same way as the first game had genies, this game had a similar enemy with a twist. They're called zombies.
Send this creature to the grave, where it belongs.
They walk around, they follow you, and they make a moaning sound, and if they're close enough to you, your mana will empty, and sometimes it makes you drop your spell that you have to pick up again. There are a few times in the game where it drops you into the middle of a bunch of these and you kind of just have to deal with them, which are the worst parts of the games, I think, except for the final boss, where the final game just sort of ended on a level like all of the others. This one ends with a really tedious battle with the big bad enemy. It's a chore. These games aren't chess. Strategy is basically side strafe while spamming your lightning on players and meteors on monsters and buildings. I know, but the boss fight is the ultimate in brute force. It's got tons of health, with an ability to push you back, constantly spawning monsters to attack you. In the end, I just had right mouse set to speed up and left mouse set to meteor level 3. I sped in, spammed an attack as much as possible until he hit me with something, then I zoomed back to my castle and repeated until it was done. I tried all sorts of spells like Reflect, Shield, other things, but nothing seemed effective at all for what he did. So what felt like forever later, 10 minutes, and done! The big bad dies, and the game's won.
You have done it. Ye gods, you have done it. Master, it is I who shall serve you henceforth.
Other than that, it's overall a much better game and experience. It has less levels, but the levels in it are better. In the latter half of Magic Carpet 1, it was mostly just maps you dreaded to come to because they were horrible, but in Magic Carpet 2, it's mostly just the final level that's not great. It even has secret levels. Magic Carpet 2 is an easier game than Magic Carpet 1, but that's in a good way. The first game was harder because the challenges it gave you late game were usually annoying, like spawning bees or wyverns all around you after taking away your castle spell, or trapping you inside a tight space next to a genie who steals all your mana and then more bees. Usually it's bees. Magic Carpet 2 did less of that, though I still think the more open gameplay of the first is missing from the sequel. There's not enough of it. It would be nice to have some of those classic maps where the goal is just to collect mana and build the castle, but there's not enough of those. It's a terrible shame as well that the high-res mode isn't usable for too long because it really looks amazing. I don't mean just like graphically impressive, but artistically. The game looks great. And the change to how the spells work is also great, where you can level up spells to unlock better versions of the same spell. So instead of Fireball and Rapid Fireball being separate spells, they're different versions of the same spell. In particular, the leveled up Castle spell, which can shoot back at nearby enemies with at first Fireballs and then Lightning. It's really satisfying. It's also easier to select the spells. So, despite its faults, which are many and numerous, to me, Magic Carpet 1 and 2 are my favourite DOS games of all time. This really illustrates the issue with modern YouTube media analysis and reviews perfectly. It's all nitpicky to the point of ruining things. Like, if you take a thing you like this game, and you dig deep and thoroughly, you'll find so many issues, and then you can list them out, like I just did, and make it sound like an awful thing with no merit. We've also heard much about Peter Molyneux, the producer of these games, the chronicler Molyneux bar. How he got his start being a games developer because Commodore, the company, was mistaken and believed his company Taurus, spelled like the constellation, was actually a different company, Taurus, spelled like the mathematical donut shape. Peter Molyneux's Taurus company was not a company that made networking software, but was in fact a company which sold baked beans to the Middle East, which he and his business partner Les Edgar had started after his first attempt at being a games developer failed. After completing this contract for Commodore, the two of them started the company Bullfrog, and switched to making games instead of selling beans. Which is a shame, because I think the Middle East would have been fixed if they'd gotten enough of Peter Molyneux's baked beans. Lots said about him, how he was always the type to overpromise and underdeliver, always making claims no one could back up. The Godus game I already mentioned with no update since 2015 and plenty of Kickstarter money taken. Most infamously the Milo demo for the Xbox 360 Kinect, which was claimed to be a virtual boy that you could talk to and show things to. No one ever came out and confirmed it, but that was definitely fake, right? Absolutely fake. We all know what it takes to do that sort of thing now, and the Xbox 360 isn't it. So he was really ahead of his time, actually, faking AI before it was the current day big thing. But in interviews, when people who worked with him talked about him, they were all positive about time spent with him. They learned things from him and relied on him for a lot of things.
And yet it was really, a really good program. He definitely taught me more than anybody else. It was just fascinating to see, how you can bring different things to the table.
He was clearly the barrier between most of the developers and the publisher or Electronic Arts to make sure their projects could still be done and not sabotaged by the business side. And when he was pushed out of the company, everyone left and it was closed down.
Because what kind of happened was everybody started to leave. So all the other senior people ended up leaving for Lionhead, and Peter left, or leaving for Big Blue Box, which later wrapped into Lionhead, or...
People don't leave the company when someone they don't like leaves. I think Peter Molyneux was critical to the success of many of these games, whether it's through direct involvement or just keeping Electronic Arts off their back. And without him, there could have been no Magic Carpet. Sometimes people like him are totally necessary. I really like these two games, Magic Carpet 1 and 2, and I come back to them regularly and still have a good time, with only a little bit of time, an experience that I don't think I can get better or at all in any other games. So despite all of the faults, despite all of its systems not really working together, despite all of the dated parts, it's still my favourite DOS game. Which is why I can't believe they keep remaking games that don't need remakes and ignoring this one. Magic Carpet is one of the best candidates for a remake. We could have a version of it that runs on modern PCs and consoles. Bigger worlds, better performance, better controls, better view distance. Imagine a terrain you can see in the distance with bigger castles on hills and unlockable characters and special carpets you have to buy separately, and cosmetics and spells that you need to get with in-game currency, season passes, separate login accounts for the one game company, always online requirements. On second thought, it's perfect the way it is. Shut it down! Shut it down!